For my ally is the Force, and a powerful ally it is. Life creates it, makes it grow. Its energy surrounds us and binds us. Luminous beings are we, not this crude matter.
Hello and welcome back to another MindMatters. I'm Elon Martin, your host, and with me in the studio today is Harrison Keeley, Adam Daniels, and our roving reporter, Lucien Koch. Today we're going to be revisiting and really expanding upon Iain McGilchrist's The Matter with Things, which we have touched upon in previous shows. I have to say that, when we first got these two volumes, I found tackling them, given everything else we're looking at and examining, kind of daunting. This book weighs approximately 47 pounds alone. It's got over 700 pages of text. And there's a real kind of imperative now with all the things that we're seeing and wanting to understand about the world to try and keep as up-to-date and abreast of information as possible. So to devote any amount of time to a single book, or in this case, 2 volumes of intellectual inquiry, it's a commitment. It's a commitment in time and focus and energy. And there has to be a very good reason, I think, to want to do all that. And having just started the introductory chapter recently, I have to say it is very well time spent. Why? Well, in the past few shows, we've talked about, just as an introductory foray into McGilchrist's exploration, what the main differences are between the left and right brains. He has looked into neurobiology, neuroscience, psychology, and a whole other array of fields to explain what the literal difference is between these 2 hemispheres, what their functions are, how they work independently of one another, how they work and complement one another, how there's a kind of asymmetrical balance to the way that they help an individual to exist in the world. But more importantly, these 2 hemispheres have a whole different set of values, priorities, ways of attending to or paying attention to reality and thoughts and what exists outside of us. And he cites over and over again how this has been demonstrated in the biological world, how animals who perceive things, including us, with our left eyes, reach or get processed, that information gets processed by the right side of the brain. And what all of those perceptions entail and what they're designed to do in the way that we interact with the world. And the same for what we perceive through our right eye and how that's processed by the left part of our brain or hemisphere. So the brain, it seems, is this biological thing that is our machinery that we process certain things through on a physical level. But there also seems to be a metaphorical significance to the differences between the left and right side of the brain, and how the mind, which may have a correlation between our 2 sides of the brain, even has this kind of extra metaphorical correlation. So there is and there isn't a literal correspondence to the mind to our different hemispheres. And we're going to get into that and a whole lot of other main points that McGilchrist brings up in The Matter with Things today.
I don't understand that last point you made about the literal and the metaphorical links. Could you explain that some more?
Sure. So in the literal, we have the way that animals, for instance, perceive the world. That the right side of the brain, for instance, will respond to the context of its environment, that it'll take on things that are in the middle ground, in the background. It'll incorporate different impressions that lend itself to to understanding its environment, where the other side of the hemisphere, for instance, has been shown to narrow down and undertake a grasping of or a direct interaction with through the narrowing of its interaction with its environment. So these are the biological things that scientists have been able to determine with experiments and the science that's done on animals and observed in the natural world. Now, when we get to the more metaphorical, for instance, which I think bears fleshing out because it's a really important part of what McGilchrist is getting at, there is, through the use of the right side of the brain, an understanding of reality, of reading reality, of attending to our experience and our environment that is understood through metaphor and allegory. And so the context is not only far broader in scope than just, say, observing the environment, but its context is expanded to include the more ineffable parts of reality, the truths that are perceived by poetry and literature and things of a more broader scope that lend themselves to ambiguity and have a more or a less kind of black and white presentation to our minds.
Mm-hmm. But you made a comment about the link between the mind and the brain, and there being a literal link and a metaphorical link between the two, or did you just like misspeak? Like, how does that relate?
Well, so each part of the brain. So I think what McGilchrist is introducing is this idea that there are definitely these biological, literal correspondences to the way that we perceive reality. But if we're also talking about the mind as a kind of non-local, larger context to the brain, if there are ideas that are perceived through the mind or through the brain, it's only through metaphor. It's not material in the way that we would interact with our environments, for instance. So I don't know if that's more clear or not. Maybe we can flesh that out a little as we go along. But it's his explanation of how things can only be understood on a more metaphorical level that doesn't have such a literal one-to-one correlation to the direct material world that we take for granted, I think.
Okay, yeah, well, I still don't understand, but we'll get there.
Well, so much of this is, that's interesting because so much of this, I think, is explained by metaphor and allegory, and I'm still coming to terms with it myself. That hopefully I will have a better kind of way of explaining it for myself and for you.
Yeah. Well, he gets the whole first volume doesn't deal with mind. Like he'll say, he gets to that in the second volume, and I haven't read how he conceives of what mind and consciousness actually are, and how they, what they are, how to think about them. So just based on what I've read, like in the first volume, the starting point for me is just to make a simpler observation that the right hemisphere is what deals in metaphor and can understand metaphor, and which is essential for dealing with reality. And the left hemisphere has no conception about metaphor, can't understand the things that the right hemisphere can through metaphor, and that all understanding, all language is based on metaphor. So to have any kind of understanding of the world, there needs to be an understanding of metaphor. And that goes very deep, but I don't know how deep that goes yet, or even how to think about that. So that's the limit of my understanding at the moment. Luke, what did you think?
Yeah, well, I'm also just at the very beginning of the first volume. So, but I think just judging by the introduction and the first things he says, it seems to me pretty clear where he's coming from, namely that essentially he's unsatisfied with the prevalent kind of materialist reductionist worldview that is pretty much an established orthodoxy in science, and even unconsciously accepted by many people. And I see his work, or I think it's really an attempt to counter that these notions. And I find his approach extremely interesting because, in a sense, it seems to me that he's kind of turning the tables, against the materialists. Because for me, like the standard, or the standard form of these kinds of reductionist, materialist, whatever you want to call it, arguments is what I like to call, to pull the Dawkins. Because it's usually, the argument goes, oh well, so you might think, that you have this grand experience and free will, and this, you see the world as kind of like even magical and whatever. But even though that's your experience, it is just wrong, because here's the science, and the science shows, it's nothing like that. It's just machinery and determinism and Darwinism and all of that. And here comes McGilchrist and kind of makes a similar argument, right? Just in reverse. So he says, look, guys, you might think that all that exists is just material stuff and just, billiard balls bouncing around, and everything is predetermined, and it's just made of small parts, and all of the materialist reductionist story. But you're wrong. Here's my science. It's just your left hemisphere thinking that constructs all this nonsense that has nothing to do with like the bigger picture and the real reality, so to speak. And I find that move like is pretty interesting, and might be even criticized a bit on that ground, but I don't think there is a good criticism of it. Maybe we can talk about that later. But in any way, event, he kind of like a committed materialist who actually wanted to argue against this point. Unless he can like prove that McGilchrist's science is wrong, But if he can't do that, then he would need to resort to the kinds of arguments that usually come from the other camp, namely, but the science cannot really tell me about my experience or whatever, So it's kind of interesting, this move, and what I really like so far in the book is that that it gives you a way, a kind of framework to look at these issues like from a totally fresh perspective, right? Because it, as you guys, I'm sure you know, right? It's really, it can be really frustrating to argue with this materialist worldview, even if it's just, you know, in your head and just trying to figure it out. Because as long as you stay in that kind of mode of thought, you know, in that kind of abstract realm of particles and evolution and all of that, and it's really, I mean, you cannot really escape it, right? So you cannot really argue against, because they always find a loophole and some story and some weird argument, you know, why you cannot really trust your own sense and your own experience, and it's really hard, and I think nobody has really achieved, like, you know, or achieved victories, so to speak, and at the end of the day, it really comes down as to, you know, differences in experience, really. And that's what, for example, David Chalmers, who coined the term the hard problem of consciousness, right? That's his conclusion as well. You know, at the end of the day, you know, when he argues with Daniel Dennett, he writes in one of his books, like, it's just, you know, what can I say? We seem to have different experiences, you know, period. You know, I mean, forget all those arguments, you know, it's just, it boils down to that. And McGilchrist really, he offers a kind of like a way out, right? Because according to this theory with the hemispheres, you know, the right hemisphere that has this more holistic kind of like non-black and white view, and can like accumulate, or how you say, like account for like a very broad experience of life and the world. And then you have the left hemisphere, who's like super abstract and constructs like a very simplistic model, and then takes that model and from that and constructs reality based on that simplistic model, basically reconstructs reality, and then says, "Oh, this is reality." And McGilchrist actually offers an explanation. You know, so yeah, it is. There are different experiences, you know, of each brain hemisphere, and that's why, you know, the materialist crowds, maybe, you know, they just, that's their way of looking at the world, you know, because they're using a certain mode of thought, and if you argue against them, you're using a different mode. So so that's I found really fascinating.
That's the point you started out with about how he kind of turns the tables and turns the argument. I'll try to phrase it in a different way, because I thought that was really funny too. So when you look at some of the hardest of hardcore materialists and reductionists, they will go so far as to say that, you know, there's no even possibility of like really free thought, because everything's determined from the things below it. So you can't actually think your own thoughts. They're only thought within you, like something is, you know, a thinking within you, and you're not controlling it. It's just somehow determined by your experiences and by your biology. And so it's kind of it's a ridiculous argument, I think, on its own, and I'll read just a short quotation that McGilchrist has afterwards. So that argument, you can take that and you can use it in many ways. You can use it in like a relativistic way, where you can say, oh, well, you only believe that because of your experiences, because of your culture, because you've been raised to believe that, or because of your biology or whatever. And so he kind of flips that around to the materialists and say, oh, well, you're only materialists because you're perceiving the world through this like left hemisphere, and that you might think that you have all the answers, but it's really just your biology talking. And so it can be reduced, or it can be kind of, because that's not exactly what he's doing, but it's kind of what he's doing. And so it can be massaged into that kind of form as a kind of Twitter takedown. But to get into that way of looking at the world, it is interesting, because he's basically saying that a lot of the arguments within philosophy and a lot of the conflicting major views in philosophy that have been around for thousands of years, the kind of the main dichotomies or the main conflicts in philosophy. Like you can have, between materialism and idealism, or any of those kind of contradictory philosophies. He's saying that, well, a lot of those philosophies, a lot of those answers to those questions really come down to the two basic ways of looking at the world. So if you're looking at it from one perspective, that's the answer you're going to get. If you look at it from the other perspective, that other one is the answer you're going to get. And it's not to say that these are determined biologically, as if we have no, as if our agency has no influence on how we think and how we choose to put arguments together or anything like that. It's more of like a lens or an influence through which you see the world that then colors your interpretation and colors the things that you see as possible or impossible. So the things you will accept or reject when forming a worldview. And but just on the subject of that kind of determinism that a hardcore materialist or reductionist might argue, he's got a good quote on page 5 from the philosopher Hans Jonas, I'm not sure how he pronounces it, where he says, well, as the philosopher Hans Jonas has observed, there is an unspoken hierarchical principle involved. Then he quotes, "The scientist does take man to be determined by causal laws, but not himself, while he assumes and exercises his freedom of inquiry and his openness to reason, evidence, and truth. His own working assumptions involve free will, deliberation, and evaluation as aspects of himself, but those qualities and capacities are stripped away from and denied to the human object or thing that he is inspecting." So this is, I think, we talked about this on a lot of our earlier shows on MindMatters, like 2 years ago. I think we kind of made a lot of these arguments in different words, but it is, I think, the ultimate takedown for that way of looking at the world is that you have to create like a bubble world in your mind space where all these things don't apply. And as long as you've got that abstract bubble world, then everything can make sense. But only the things within that bubble world, everything outside the bubble world still doesn't make sense, because you can imagine a world without free will or the ability to reason or the actual rules or rules isn't the best word, but the way reason works. You can imagine that kind of world and you can play with it and see how things work within that world. But behind that there is an absolute presupposition or an underlying axiom that reason and free inquiry are possible, because that's what you're doing by doing that. So when you have like a Dawkins or a Dennett or someone, some guys that are even more extreme saying certain things, well, the kind of Twitter takedown is that, well, why should I take anything you say seriously if you have no free will and you haven't been able, and if you yourself haven't constructed this argument based on evidence and based on these non-physical principles? Because whenever you reason about something, whenever you reason by logic or by utilizing evidence, you're doing something non-physical, because you have to have a mind space in which you're comparing things and comparing them to a non-physical like ideal. There's this thing called truth, and these things work towards it. This kind of evidence supports it, and this doesn't. In order to be able to reason, you need a certain degree of freedom. You need the ability to say, yes, this fits, or no, this doesn't. If everything is biologically determined, then you have no capacity to actually reason. And therefore, any argument that you make is not actually an argument. It's just your vocal cords producing sounds that are based on these mechanical impulses in your brain that can't be trusted, because it's just, maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong, but we have no way to know, because there's no way to actually compare that to an actual truth. And you're just deluding yourself if you think that you can even approach that any type of level to truth. It's just all determined by something, and we're just passive bystanders who have no ability to comprehend it.
And that's like
yeah.
Well, I was just going to jump in and say that it's one of the good things about his introduction is how he introduces these topics, which he himself says that he is intending to
upend everyone's worldviews. And he's hoping to do it in a way that, is closer to the truth, and it allows us to have a better understanding of who we are as human beings, and also what the world actually is and how we interact with it. And there's two things that he brings up as points of, I guess, like common arguments. One of them being I think he calls it naive reductionism.
Naive realism?
Is it realism? It might be naive realism, where everything is, well, yeah, it's kind of like that's where the reductionist standpoint kind of, gets taken to its logical conclusion, where everything is merely parts. There is no whole. The whole is merely the sum of its parts, really. So you can just kind of totally disregard the whole, since it is nothing more than just a sum of parts. So therefore, the whole doesn't matter. It's only the parts that matter. And then he, kind of discusses where the fault lies with that is that there is no discrete non-universe. We can't go outside of ourselves. You can create a mind space where it is, in this imaginary context, a little thought bubble, but even that thought bubble is within your mind, which is within the world. So there's no way of getting outside of oneself in order to do any kind of evaluation like that. So
there's no view from nowhere.
There's no view from nowhere. So there's really no parts, is his point. In which case, then you have to see everything as a whole, which itself is kind of, it reminded me of Alfred North Whitehead and his system of process philosophy in that respect, where everything is a whole and all is interrelated to everything else, and nothing has context outside of its relationship to everything else. So that's like one common take on the situation that he presents. And then the other one is naive idealism, where it's very much the postmodernist view, where you only think things because of your upbringing and your indoctrination and your privilege, and so there's no such thing as truth or anything like that, because it's all just programmed into you from the beginning, and that's also wrong because of similar reasons. So the way that he introduces these concepts and breaks them down in coherent, logical ways they're really like brilliant on the one hand, and at the same time like really obvious. That you're just kind of like it follows through on his intention of like upending your worldview, but in a gentle way that he says he hopes feels more like coming home than anything else. And at least so far that's been the case of what what we've read, where it's just kind of like, oh. So I'm liking where it's going.
It is a very kind of gentle urging for people to consider how this framework might be a tool by which to understand how they interact with the world, with their thoughts and their perceptions. And just to make a point here, he doesn't say that right brain thinking is, he doesn't put it on he does kind of raise its value, that he is attempting to invigorate what it is about right brain thinking that should be appreciated and ascertained. However, it's important to realize that it is both types of hemispheric thinking and ways of interacting that we couldn't do without. But his point of contention, what he's trying to draw attention to, is the idea that Western civilization, the way we've come to interact with the world has been narrowed down, and where we've emphasized this kind of this part at the expense of the whole way of looking at things, where we've taken for granted the larger context and meaning and interconnectedness and relationships between those parts, and how a fuller, deeper understanding of how things work together, what the fuller context is for everything, is something that we need to, or we should be, or we can be aspiring to, as opposed to, when you have a hammer, everything you're looking at appears as a nail, which is, getting back to all of the kinds of madness of crowds and ideological possession, which he hasn't exactly gotten into yet. This narrowing, this earlier, Harrison, you mentioned this filter, this lens by which we can perceive the world gets narrowed down to such a point that, to quote a cliche, we're missing the forest for the trees. So it reminded me actually of this, Philosophy 101 painting by René Magritte. If you ask anyone, what this is, naturally they say, well, it's a pipe. And, Magritte's going to say, no, it's a representation of a pipe. It is, so it's that to me, it was a reminder of just how much broader we can come to think about things. But there is one part of our mind, or one use of one hemisphere of our minds that tends to narrow things down to such a degree that it becomes almost detrimental to the way we exist.
Yeah, and I think what's really important, or a really important point he makes all the time, or like repeatedly, and I really like that. I think it's really important, is what he calls, I think, the big and, right? So that things just that there can be different ways of looking at the world side by side, and he criticizes basically this notion of nothing but. So that's what usually, like, the materialist crowd is advancing. So your mind is nothing but the brain, right? Or your emotions are nothing but evolutionary strategies or whatever. And I think that's really, really interesting, this notion of the big and our left hemispheres, I think, really hate it, right? And I know for myself that I can fall into that trap as well. So it's really difficult to really take that seriously, to that there can be different ways of looking at things, and they can stand side by side, even though they seem to contradict each other. For example, it's useful to look at the brain as a computer, in certain respects. We talk about like how one can be programmed, right, and how it performs different functions and all of that, and it is useful in certain respects, but that doesn't mean that it's also not something else entirely, right? So and these kinds of things, it's hard in when you're like thinking analytically about things. It's really hard to sustain, and I think we all know a whole lot of examples where this kind of dynamic can play out. I mean, what came to mind, for example, I mean, just to throw it out there, I mean, the discussion between like capitalism and socialism or something like that, right? So it's like, the analytical mind that wants just to define things, and put it in boxes and say this is true or that is true. But the thing is, there's so many different ways of looking at the world, and it doesn't mean that everyone is right and we can just invent whatever we want and there's no difference between right and wrong or between true and false. But there is definitely something to be said about this big and I found that very, very, let's say, useful, even to keep these things in mind when thinking about the world. And it also helps understanding different takes on the same thing, basically, and being able to go from one level or way of looking at it to another, and gain a wider understanding by doing so, and not freaking out, with the first encounter of a contradiction or something that you cannot really put right in your head. I don't know if you understand what I mean.
Yes. Yeah, Luke, actually, that's a good point, because the ability to see how something that is contradictory or seemingly contradictory at the same time, that this and allows for both dimensions of a particular news item or fact of reality or seeming paradox to exist simultaneously, so that you don't need to force yourself into just accepting and rejecting two parts of a story, for instance, or two parts of an object, or what is it about particles and waves as a descriptor of, is it light, or is it, so it's both. You examine light under one set of circumstances and tools, and you'll see that they're made up of particles. Another way of looking at it would show up the waves dimension of it, and yet it's both at the same time. But if you're that scientist who only looks at particles, or at the same time only looks at waves, you're not going to see how both exist simultaneously. And so that's what he's arguing for as well in the and, as you mentioned, the truth or larger reality of something having several different dimensions or sides to it.
Mm-hmm. And the advantage of he'd say the advantage of the right hemisphere view of the world is that it incorporates the left hemisphere view of the world, but not vice versa. The left hemisphere doesn't incorporate the right hemisphere view. So, like, one example of that I find is, like, if you look at something like Darwinism or like evolutionary psychology, like, I can see how a lot of that, how that perspective makes sense and does explain a lot of the world and human behavior, for instance. So you see, like, evolutionary psychologists who will look at a human behavior and say, oh, it is for this kind of survival purpose that it serves its function and the reason we have it. And as far as that goes, I usually agree with a lot of those takes, but that's not to say that's all that's going on. It's not like a nothing but situation. There was one example in, I won't be able to remember the details, but this was from Stephen Porges' book on the polyvagal theory, and he's talking about, like, the emergence of emotions and how they serve this function, and the reason they emerged was, A, B, or C, or whatever. And you can pretty much take all the same facts and just add kind of another layer to it, and you have that description, but you've also got another way on top of it that puts it into a bigger context that maybe it's not that emotions just emerged out of nowhere for these prior reasons, but that was always kind of a potential unfolding to enlarge the experience of what we call life. That there are well, basically that there is a larger picture, that there is a larger even goal or purpose in mind, and that maybe a purpose of life is to experience the expansion and like complexification of the emotional life of creatures. But when you're only looking at it from the bottom to the top, then it appears as this kind of totally random or contingent, like just this weird thing happened, and all of a sudden we could experience these emotions, or experience like the ability to understand mathematics or whatever, and it just kind of came out of nowhere and for no reason, and it just happens that it turned out to be useful in certain ways, but maybe that is maybe there is kind of a full kind of potential. There's a huge potential, and what evolution is the unfolding of that potential, the manifestation of that potential, and so you can look at it from just in terms of the wide scope, and that's like one of the most extremes of that would be just kind of primitive creationism, that everything was just created the way it is because God wanted it that way, but that leaves out all of the interesting details that you get from the left hemisphere perspective. It's like, well, it's not that simple. If you actually look at there is a progression of life that you see in the historical record, and so it's like the hardcore materialist scientists do have a point. They've got something on their side, but when you look at it just from their perspective, then you get this kind of clinical, lifeless kind of accidental universe where nothing really makes sense, and it's like, oh well, it's just this, or it's nothing but that. But I think it's possible to put the two together, and I think that's what McGilchrist does very well, is to take all of the science and to really find all of those interesting and like informative facts and details, and put them together into a picture, and then place them into this wider context where that others, where others he goes where others fear to tread in placing them in this wider context. And so I just started the second volume, and that's where I think things will be getting a lot even more interesting. Because that's where he'll be dealing with things like the nature of matter and consciousness, and he's dropped a couple hints on how he views like evolution, and how he kind of he doesn't, from the impression I get just from the few little offhand comments he makes in the book so far, he's not gung-ho for intelligent design, but neither is he gung-ho for like reductionist materialism. So it'll be interesting to see where he goes on that topic, but on all others too.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you guys about what you think about his take on evolution, but it seems like we're all a bit far from from where he actually goes into that. But it seemed to me like a bit Whiteheadian in a sense. That what you said, Harrison, that there seems to be some kind of attractors, like as Whitehead, I think, puts it, that act as a teleology, basically, like that attract certain developments and certain potentials, let's say, that are possible, and kind of develop a pull that kind of attracts us, so to speak. So I found it interesting what you said about kind of like combining these two perspectives, and in that sense, I just thought when I heard you talk about it, I just thought maybe one could think about emotions having evolved for survival and all of that. Maybe it's actually, like you said, that it is in a way a potential that was always there, It's just that it must somehow be compatible with survival, right? I mean, otherwise it wouldn't work. So and when you look at it from the materialist perspective, then all you see is survival, and then you conclude it's because of the survival that all of that happened. But actually, like, survival might just be like one condition of the whole thing, right? So,
Right, it's
so it's kind of interesting how. Yeah, it's like the condition, right? And I thought that's really interesting, and that's, I think, the kind of insights you can get when you follow this and approach, right? And just be cool with it, that there are some things that you just cannot figure out yet, and that kind of seem to contradict one another.
There's there's one particularly interesting point that McGilchrist makes, where he's talking about this particular mountain. I can't remember where it is exactly, but he gives the Nordic name for the mountain, which stands for like sloping mountain or sloping hill or sloping rock.
It's either Scotland or Iceland.
I think it's Scotland, yeah. So it's a Scottish mountain, and then the Nordics gave it this particular name called the sloping rock, because that's what it looks like coming from the seas. It just looks like a sloping rock. And then he goes through these different various types of people. So like a physicist looks at this mountain and says, oh, it's 99% empty space, and then 0.1% of something we don't quite know what yet. And then a geologist would look at it and be like, oh, it's all like basalt or something like that. So there's all of these different various ways that you can look at one particular thing. Not any of them are wrong necessarily, but none of them truly encapsulates what the mountain is in total or in totem, which is similar to something that we had talked about with Juliana Barenboim, and talking about language and how language has this way of representing a thing, but the thing itself is kind of ineffable in that kind of a way, where there's so many different various aspects and ways of looking at any one particular thing that it's impossible to truly know it in all its complexities. And so you can get a similar. That's kind of how I see like the discussion on emotions. Each of these different perspectives that have been brought up thus far, each holds its own kind of view on emotions, which are true so far as they go, but they aren't, what emotions truly are. And I was just thinking that, like, at a basic level, biologically speaking, it's all kind of coming out of biological nervous system function, right? Like the finer emotions or the higher emotions or the more complex emotions, they're all built out of the apparatuses that kind of stem from being able to feel or to sense. It's all part of this sensational thing, being able to feel cold or heat, being able to feel hunger. Those are the very basic building blocks on which higher functions can be built. And then it's a question of, whether something decided it wanted to build that out, or if it's kind of like, I think it was David Ray Griffin in one of his books on, what was it? It's a green book and I can't remember the name of it. But anyways, he's talking about saltationism and inner gradualism and external saltationism. So that was what he was talking about, and how there's this inner gradual inner development, right? So if you're able to feel and to sense hot and cold, hunger and thirst at these very base levels, and then all of a sudden you're like, maybe there's something more that can come out of this, like you were saying, Lucien, like there's a potential here, and I can recognize the potential, and it's like, I don't, how do I get there? And then eventually something happens, and then, now you have this potential for for joy and for anger and for all of these other various things that are just an extension of what was already there before.
Yeah, it's, well, more than that too, because that's when you see the saltationism, the external saltationism, right? So that's when you get something new that emerges. So the way I remember him describing it is, because Griffin too doesn't like intelligent design, but neither does he like Darwinism, like in their extreme form. So he kind of takes this middle Whiteheadian ground where there is a gradualism and it's all kind of rooted within the individual, whether that's a fruit fly or a human, and that you have that level of experience. And like you're saying, you've got these sensory experiences, like of hot and cold and these basic emotions. And it's like the experience that you then have with all of those things at your disposal, it then gets you a little bit closer to that attractor where you can then say, oh, well, that's possible too. And it's an unconscious process. It's not like you're thinking this. This is just the voice that we give to the process. And then when it grasps that potential, then that potential then becomes instantiated or manifested within the individual. And that leads to the creation of that new ability or that new sensory experience that, when looked at from the outside, looks like it just came out of nowhere. But he's saying that every saltation, every new emergence of something in the world, whether that's in evolution or in just a person's life, that's the process that's going on, is that there are these potentials, these external, that's just a way of thinking of them, attractors, that the closer you get to them, the more influence they can have, and then they can then be incorporated into the being, because that relates to something else McGilchrist talks about in the introduction about the nature of reality, that we are essentially, there's an element or an aspect, or it's more than that, of co-creation, that we co-create the world, that we are creating the world just as the world is creating us. And that's because what Whitehead would say is that at any given instant, in any given process, we are incorporating all of everything. Everything is influencing everything at any given moment, and we're incorporating all of the experience of everything to create ourselves. And it's creative because everything does it slightly differently. Everything's incorporating everything else in a slightly different way, from a slightly different point of view, with slightly different purposes and goals and aims in mind. And so, like with our shows on James Carpenter's work on First Sight, there's this in the background, we're kind of aware of everything, but because every individual has purposes and needs in the moment and in a context, a lot of that becomes irrelevant. So I'm not going to actively incorporate something going on the other side of the universe in another galaxy, because that's going to be irrelevant for me. The most relevant things are going to be the stuff surrounding me, mostly in my immediate environment at any given moment, but then also the things in my my community, my town or my city, my country, the world, the solar system. And it's like the further out you get, the less important and less relevant things become for each individual. And so this kind of gets back to the point Luke and I were making, I think, about survival, and you brought up you had a good word for it, Adam, as building blocks. It's like everything. First of all, everything's made of what we think of as matter. The periodic table of elements, all the things that we see in the world, ourselves. So there are certain limits placed upon what can happen in the universe by virtue of the elements out of which the universe is made, and the specific mathematical, physical rules and interactions that can happen, like certain elements combine to make certain molecules, and there are limits to that. It's like you can't take hydrogen and zinc and make water. It's just not going to work. That's one of the limits of reality as we experience it, is that it needs to be hydrogen and oxygen, and that's what water is. And so that kind of principle can apply all the way up, but you can't reduce everything to their elements. because you can't reduce everything to hydrogen and oxygen, for instance, because that doesn't account for water. Water is something qualitatively different than either hydrogen or oxygen. And then the same thing applies on a biological level. You've got kind of like these biological building blocks or basics that you have to take into account, that must be taken into account for life. And those are the things for survival. So of course, whenever you're looking at biology, survival is always going to be this bedrock that you're going to have to make reference to. It's not like it can be completely ignored. It's not like we can think about humans, but we just totally take survival out of it, and we think about humans in those terms, because we'll get just a ridiculous picture of humanity that has no relation to the actual facts on the ground. So that's why like evolutionary psychology, makes sense, because they're looking at something real. They're looking at real conditions. It's just maybe they're not seeing the full picture. And this is where an idea that he mentions in this introduction, I find is apropos and very interesting. He talks about this idea of the limit case. I'm just going to read a couple paragraphs and then see what you guys think. So how does he put it? So he says basically that this idea of the limit case is going to be important in this book. And I don't know if he actually gives what I would consider like a very clear definition of the limit case. So he gives various examples to kind of get an idea of what it is. Let's see. So the first example he gives is that randomness is the limit case of order. And then I'll read the paragraph that follows. Complexity and simplicity are relative terms. However, complexity is surely, we imagine, a more unusual state of affairs arising out of the agglomeration of more simple elements, isn't it? I believe that this is a mistake, one all too understandable given our worldview, but a mistake nonetheless. Rather, complexity is the norm, and simplicity represents a special case of complexity, achieved by cleaving off and disregarding almost all of the vast reality that surrounds whatever it is we are for the moment modeling as simple. Simplicity is a feature of our model, not of the reality that is modeled. In keeping with this, and don't worry, right now this should seem crazy, inanimacy is better regarded as the limit case of animacy, something I will come to later in this book. Potential is not simply all the things that never happened, a ghostly penumbra around the actual. The actual is a limit case of the potential, which is equally real, the one into which it collapses out of the many, as the particle is the collapse of a quantum field. The particle is not more real than the field, rather it is a special case of the field, in which its field-like characteristics are at a minimum. Similarly, the wholly determinate, were it to exist, which it does not, would be the limit case of the indeterminate. So that's something that I hope that we'll come back to after finishing the book, because it's hard for me to even put into words how I understand that, but it makes sense. I wish I could articulate it better. But it's like,
Yeah.
Go ahead, Luke. Or are you just agreeing?
I don't know. No, I agree, but I actually really found that I'm really looking forward to reading more about that, because I had this idea before, about limit cases in a bit of a different context, and I was like thrilled to have like McGilchrist, not only like having thought about this concept, but apparently like taking it really, really far, because and I had thought about it along the lines, like there's always this in philosophy. There's always these examples that people work with, right? So when you think about language, or for example, you kind of like think about, oh, there's a table, just before me, and so the word table and the object table, so it's kind of like that there's a connection, and then you come to this kind of realist theories, right? So okay, so the word table is just I think correspondence theory, they call it, is just corresponds to the table, and there's this, and then there are problems, and you think about it, blah blah blah, and I think it's actually like maybe it's an example of a limit case, right? So because the example is so incredibly stupidly simple, because you're talking about the table that is in front of you, that you can actually like construct a whole like theory around it. But it might be just a limit case, because language usually does not work at all like that. It's just because of the extreme simplicity. It seems as if it's just a correspondence between a word and an object, but that's not real life, so to speak, right? And so in that context, I thought about this idea of a limit case, and I think it might be really fascinating what he has to say, and I'm looking forward to it. Like for when he says that the inanimate is just a limit case of the animate, and I think that's a similar idea, right? So you say, okay, that piece of rock, it's pretty dead, but but it's just like one simple example of something that is like pretty dead, but there's like tons of things that are like totally alive, right? So it's very interesting.
Yeah, I think we'll maybe we'll have a future show on that, because there's a lot more that can be said on it, and I don't know if we can say it at this point with any degree of clarity. But one thing, like one way of looking at that, just to relate this back to the conversation we've been having, is kind of to see survival, for instance, as maybe a limit case of human experience. It's like it's the kind of very basic level of human experience that accounts for a lot of it. Just like inanimate matter, of course, it makes up all of the matter that makes up things, makes up the universe, but that it's nested within a bigger context in which it's not the only thing that exists. So when you look at like inanimacy, when you look at the inanimate, people think of it as inanimate, as something opposed to and different from something that's animate, when really it is a special case of the animate. It's just the animate in its most simple form and its least animate form. And the idea of randomness being the limit case of order, that the norm within the cosmos is order, but that the least amount of order is in that randomness, which there might not even be such a thing as perfect randomness. There could be an order behind it, in the sense that the randomness only exists within a wider order, within a bigger order. So maybe I'll leave it at that.
Well, maybe I'm going to have a go at this here. One thing that I thought was particularly brilliant in framing everything in this way is it's something that we've talked about in other shows, where consciousness cannot arise from purely inanimate matter. Like, you can't have just purely inanimate matter and then have something new come out from that. But it can be the reverse, where you have pure consciousness that then gives rise to something that is seemingly non-conscious and yet is on a very, very base or basic level. And so that's kind of how I'm looking at these limit cases, is that the way that it's normally framed is that these special things come out of nowhere, out of something that is seemingly impossible. Well, then if it's seemingly impossible, it probably is, and you just need to rethink how you're looking at it. And so then it becomes the opposite, where it's like, order is the name of the game, which makes sense as you look around and you see stars and planets and trees and so on and so forth. That chaos is but a fringe part of that, where it is the least amount of order, as opposed to being the other way around.
Yeah. So you look at the limit case of something, and you assume that that's all there is, and therefore the actual thing of which it's a limit case is impossible and doesn't make any sense. Whereas if you just flip it around and look at things in terms of the non-special case, the non-limit case, then the limit case makes sense. So yeah, that's a cool way of putting it.
I think one way he helps to explain this was in his description of dichotomies and how some things aren't a true dichotomy, and that so many things exist along a spectrum or a continuum of reality. That there is, you used that word before, nested within. There are these things that are connected to larger pieces of how things exist as a whole that shouldn't and can't be seen as in direct opposition to, for instance, even though they may appear to be that way on the surface. And there was something I wanted to get back to that you mentioned a little earlier, Luke, and that is that, why do we like this material? Why does it speak to us, I think? And I think that there's this kind of intuitive understanding for what he's saying, these ideas that we're trying to work out for ourselves, but that he completely fleshes out in the full. And as you said earlier, Adam, he takes to a logical conclusion in many cases. So I'm looking forward to see where all of this goes. I may have been extrapolating a bit too much with the metaphorical side of the brain as it relates to the mind a little earlier, but it's definitely a lot of fun too to read this stuff and to say, okay, where is he? What's his next step in this venture?
It's going to happen next.
Yes. Did we have anything else that we wanted to add to the mix today, or are we good?
I think that was all I wanted to talk about. Well, just to give viewers and listeners an idea, in this introduction, it's like 60 pages or something. Before we started recording, Luke pointed out that it's pretty much as long as Machiavelli's The Prince, which we covered in a previous show. So it gives an idea of the scope of the work. And in it, he's got a section that we didn't really touch on, where he goes through a couple sections where he describes some of the basics of the right hemisphere, left hemisphere hypothesis. So the differences between them. So he gives a summary version of all the stuff that he'll go through in the first, several hundred pages. And then he anticipates some objections and criticisms and responds to those. And we really just scratched the surface even of this introduction, just to give you all an idea of what's going on here. But anything else? Did you have any other thoughts?
I just want to give a plug. I like to kind of do a little motivational speech at the end.
Okay, go ahead.
The thing is super heavy, right? It's super expensive. It is, as I think I watched an interview with McGilchrist where he said it's longer than the Bible, and so it's really like quite a commitment, as you said at the beginning, Ilan. But I really want to encourage people to take the plunge. I think there's a Kindle version as well that is cheaper, and it's one of the first books, by the way, that I didn't dare underlining stuff and taking notes, because it's just such a gorgeous hardcover book. I mean, they don't make these books anymore, right? I mean, it's just really good. So I think it is something that one doesn't necessarily have to read cover to cover, or it's there's so much in there that even if you're reading 10 pages, there's already so much wisdom in there that I think it's the kind of book that could really help, getting new ideas, getting your thoughts together. So highly recommended so far.
Yeah. And the pleasure of it is that it's so accessible. And you read these little promotional paragraphs by fellow writers that rave about it, and you see for yourself, why it's so well lauded and appreciated by so many. You just imagine that in your own personal library, you have your own like column with one of those, book stands, and you have one of McGilchrist's books kind of sitting there that you refer to and read a few pages at a time and meditate
you
upon.
have a pedestal, and then the light shines down and angels sing as you open it up.
Well, I just want to second what you were saying, Luke, is that it is a beautiful book. It's a well-made book. And as you know, I kind of like books, and you just, like you said, you just don't see quality like this anymore. It's a well-made book. The paper is high quality. The stitching, like the way it's put together, the way it opens and the pages unfold, like and even the typesetting, like it's
I love that
unique
too.
and just beautiful. So I did underline. I just made sure that my underlines were as straight and neat as possible on this one. But it's a good.
I switched to I have a notebook anyway, and I just it was kind of like more work because I always wrote page 45 blah 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 blah, and it's more work than just underlining. But somehow I couldn't bring myself because it's just so beautiful. But then I had a peanut finger and messed it up from the side anyway, and I was like, maybe I can just go ahead and write into it, right?
I was drinking coffee this morning while reading, and I thought, don't you dare get sloppy with that coffee. You're not going to get a drop of that coffee on this book. It's too nice.
But just a quick rant before we close out. That reminds me of, I mentioned they don't make books like this anymore. Some of the books, some of the hardcovers that you get, from major publishers, and even academic books that are super expensive, like this one, but any kind of university press academic book that they're only expecting to sell, several hundred copies because it's such a niche market. So they'll make a hardcover and sell it for $100 or more, even if it's like a 300, 200 page book. Even those books, I've had expensive academic books like that fall apart, because they've got cheap glue and the pages just end up, coming out, and you can't, the pages don't fold open when you open it. So if like me, you get annoyed by bad quality books, then just get this book and you'll have a good quality book that you can enjoy.
Maybe a little fun fact at the end, because I just remember a month ago or so, I looked into the video where he had his book presentation, McGilchrist, because by the way, it was out of print apparently in Europe, so I had to wait a lot of time for it. And in that book presentation, there was one guy from the editor, I guess. And the story is that he wanted to publish it with Penguin, I think, which is like a big mainstream edition publisher, and they apparently told him, okay, listen, you need to basically like quarter it and do like a much shorter version of it, because it's just no way we can publish this this much text. And then this small publisher got involved, I don't know the name right now, but and so they said, okay, we don't care if it costs like $130, we do like an awesome beautiful 2 volumes, really thick and heavy book, and so hooray, good for them.
It's Perspectiva is the name of the publisher.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Well, thanks everybody for listening. We hope to be revisiting The Matter with Things and other ideas by McGilchrist in future shows for sure. And we have a lot in the works that we look forward to sharing with you and presenting to you. And in the meantime, keep safe and keep on trucking. Keep on trucking and keep on thinking with your right brains, if at all possible. Take care.